Hi, and welcome to the latest 5 from the Archive with Camversation. This time it's Erin Byrne who presents something quite different on Camversation. She's going to be talking about her creative painting and her creative outlets and how this is going to link into some absolutely fantastic things on Camversation in the next few months. Don't miss it. So, Erin, thank you so much for coming along today to talk to us about your art and also what you're interested in sharing with us at Camversation. I'm just going to say to everybody who's watching, this is a really weird situation because Erin is there. I'm going to look at Erin right now. Erin's only about 2 meters away from me, and we've spent about 40 minutes trying to get these microphones working perfectly. And we hope they're there, but we're still going to have to have a bit of a tinker with the tech to make it work as well. But thanks so much for coming on, Erin. I'm really pleased that we're able to do this right now. So, Erin, just before I get kicked off, there's lots of people who come to Camversation because they really enjoy photography, really enjoy being creative and artistic. And loads of people have been asking for a way to, I suppose, explore that art in different ways. And you and I got chatting about what you're interested in and the kind of art that you enjoy. So I'm really looking forward to sharing some of that as well. But I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about yourself before we even get going with that, please.
Yes, of course. So at the moment, I'm practicing as a fine artist, as you know, but actually my background's in design. So I trained as an architect originally and worked as an architect in London for a number of years, working on community projects and arts-based projects, and actually then moved into urban design and town planning. So I worked in the public sector for a while. I worked for the Mayor of London, and I also worked for the London Legacy Development Corporation, which is a mouthful, but that's the organisation that oversees the transformation of the Olympic Park. So converting it from a park that has been used for the Olympic Games into an amazing mixed-use neighbourhood. And so, that was quite an amazing sort of 15 years of working on really exciting, amazing projects, and meeting amazing people. But I guess if I'm looking back on it now, over that time, I moved away from being the creative person that I was when I was younger. And I moved more into being a project manager or a people manager and sort of started to manage quite large teams. And that brought in a stress element. And I guess what happened was, I think life got in the way and my creativity dried up. So for about 10 years, I didn't really make anything at all, apart from the odd Christmas card or birthday card. So actually then 2 years ago, I had this very lucky opportunity to take voluntary redundancy from my job. And so I decided to take a career break, basically just get to know myself again and give myself the space to sort of pursue my interests and to really think about what my next step was going to be. And almost by accident, really, I just started making art again. It wasn't planned, mainly drawing and painting, and making things with my hands. And that was very linked, I think, to the pandemic, because I've been basically on Teams for 2 years solidly. I think everyone can relate to that. Yeah. And, so I had this desire to make things again. And, I started to make sketchbooks and do sketching and drawing. And I just felt like I was also really getting away from the computer and my phone. And I had a feeling of returning home, basically. Yeah. And so I decided to do a course. I studied at an art school called the Margate School for a year. And I haven't really looked back since then. Now I spend part of my week as a technician in the print room at Canterbury College. So I work with young people and, I'm basically making art and helping them to make art every day with a focus on printmaking. And then the rest of the week, I make my own art and I teach workshops and I look after my daughter and enjoy the wonderful landscapes at Kent. So yeah, it's quite a journey. Quite a journey. Yeah, it really is. But I definitely think that kind of rich tapestry of experiences has fed into my visual literacy. Yeah. And when we start to talk about my work, I can definitely see those different sides of me, like the kind of slightly pedantic architect, designer, And then this sort of new side of me that I'm exploring through mark making, which we'll be able to really share through the course that we're starting in September.
Yeah, fantastic. And one of the things that really came across when you and I were chatting was your passion to get people out of like this kind of rut that they may be in. And perhaps that is exemplified in your own experience as well, because you felt a little bit held back as well.
Definitely.
Why you look for it in other people.
I think so. I think I don't really notice myself doing it. Often people have observed me doing it, but if I can see that somebody is, struggling with a creative project, or they want to make something, you can get a feeling from them that they're desperate to make something, but they don't know what, and they don't know where to start. I am just in there, I'm just like, I really want to help them. And I think what I learned is it's about finding your personal voice and not trying to be something that you're not, which is quite difficult to do, but actually it's actually really easy once you start to think differently and get more in touch with what you like rather than what you think you should like. Then it's a really exciting journey to go on. And I think, and I actually, hopefully, what I've done with the images I've selected today is I've tried to focus on how perhaps mark making has developed my practice through time, to show that it's not just about making marks being a beautiful and wonderful activity on its own, which it is, and it's very mindful and it's very good for your nervous system, but it can also feed into your own creative work in lots of unexpected ways, like a kind of handwriting in a way, or I keep saying it, but I think it's like your voice, basically.
Fantastic. Well, in that case, we shall not hold back anymore, and we'll use our studio setup that we've been spending the last hour kicking around and trying to make it work. And we've switched everything off and on 15 times, so we know it's going to be fine now.
Absolutely fine.
This is really exciting for me as well from a technical challenge. So what I'll do is I will flip to the overhead camera and we can see some of your work as well. Okay, Erin, now we are in our makeshift studio, if you like, and we've got our camera down. And for a techie point of view, I know there are lots of photographers who love this. You'd be really envious of this setup that we've got right now. We've got lights and cameras absolutely everywhere. But Erin, do talk us through your first image that you've brought today, your first piece of art.
Absolutely. So this image is very meaningful to me. Basically, I'm looking at my 17-year-old self here. So this was a painting I did when I was 17. So I was still at school, and I absolutely love this image. It's not even finished. I don't know if you can see, but this is actually a print of the image, and it's probably about a meter tall. And it's on cardboard, so it's got this unfinished quality to it. And I just love the way that I'm looking directly at the viewer. I just feel like I have this confidence. And yeah, it is interesting for me to look back at her, because I feel like when I was 17, I was very creative. So I would write poetry, I would write music, I played guitar, I made my own clothes. And I used to spend hours and hours and hours in this room here, which is called A6. It was one of the art rooms at my school. And I just used to go there every day after school and just stay for hours and hours and hours and paint and paint and paint. And I wasn't trying to be a painter or an artist. It just was completely natural to me. That's how I wanted to spend my time. And I was very lucky because I was taught by somebody called Mark Dunford, who is he's now based in Cornwall. So he's a Cornwall-based artist. And he was taught by Ewan Uglow at the Slade and was part of a amazing movement of painters in the 90s. And so I was very privileged to be taught at my secondary school by this amazing painter. And basically what I became obsessed with was painting light. So this painting was just basically looking at all these different, like the local colour of each surface was white. So you had the white walls in the background, you've got the white apron, and then you've got the white tiled floor. But what I was doing was searching for the colours within that, and, sort of almost seeing, just trying to look really deeply at what I was actually seeing rather than what my brain was telling me the colours were. And And then I put a very simple device, which was a lamp on the floor, which creates this like warm glow. And then there's this ambient natural daylight coming in. So together, that means that you've got this shift from warm to cool in the color spectrum. And I'm basically slightly obsessively trying to concoct that. And so, each one of these tiles, I know in my brain is white, but actually I've got peach and turquoise and raw amber and all sorts of pigments in there. And then also I don't even know why, but I chose this electric blue jumper to wear, which I wore every day for like a month. But I really liked the complementary colors of this sort of ochre warm light and the blue. So in some ways it's a really simple image, but I really love it. And I feel like I mentioned before, this idea of like coming home to art, like this feeling of like returning. And so part of me feels almost like, through adulthood, after I was 17, I had all these responsibilities. I went to university and I actually felt like I lost my creative confidence. So for me, I'm interested in sort of coming back to being this girl again. And it's also fascinating to see how I've actually got a lot of the muscle memory of those painting techniques. So if I show you my next image, I'm actually going to show you them together, which I haven't done before.
Oh, let's see how we go with this.
Yeah, let's see how it works. So this is actually a high resolution scan of one of my paintings of All Marshes, which is beautiful marshland landscape next to Faversham, where Mark and I both live. And this place has such amazing memories for me, as it's just a 5-minute walk from my house. And I spend a lot of time walking in this landscape. But what I think is really interesting is if you look at the colors, I'm obviously still obsessed with this turquoisey cerulean blue color, and then you've got the warmth of the sky going into the cool colors, and it's really reminded me of what was going on here. But also I think what's interesting is that this image actually is printed out twice as big as the original, so the painting is actually that big. So what I did was I did a high resolution scan of it, and then I printed it with G-clay inks, which I'm obsessed with G-clay printing. I think it's really interesting because what it's done is it's highlighted these marks, which are actually quite tiny, but you can see where I've like splattered the ink. And then in the foreground, I've really tried to capture the texture of the foliage and the marshland in contrast to what's actually quite a graphic sky and a clean water. So I guess it's like I'm carrying on this obsession with light and trying to paint the color of light. But I think what I've moved on to here is much more explorative mark making. And there's actually a 20-year gap. So I didn't paint between these two. So this was my final piece at A level. And then this is what I painted 2 years ago. And it was fascinating watching my hand doing it, because I didn't know I could still do it in a way. And so that's just one thing I would say to anybody who's looking at being creative or coming back to being creative, having had a break, is it's not necessarily about signing up for something completely new. Sometimes that's really enjoyable, but actually sometimes it's about this feeling of coming home and just to get your confidence back, going back to something that you know and helping you take these stepping stones back into doing something creative. The other thing as well that I wanted to say about this is that I also, for me, painting is quite a feat. It's quite a big build up to it. I'm not someone who can paint all day. I find it very emotionally exhausting. And actually what I have to do in order to make a painting is have what I describe as a very strong sensory experience in a landscape. So you'll see all of my work is about landscape. Maybe that's a rebellion against being an architect. I don't know. Ask my therapist. But yeah, I think it's that basically you have to have this sort of a moment, like an experience. And this was a walk that I did with my daughter and my partner as the sun was going down. It was quite late, we were kind of racing against the sun and it was getting a bit cold and my daughter wanted to go home, but we were just, enjoying this incredible moment of seeing these sort of licorice blacks, like all of the foliage and grasses all going into this really dark color. And I think I just love that transition between times of day and capturing it. And so that's what I realized in order to. So in the past, I have done commissions, and I've actually have found that quite difficult. If I'm painting something that I haven't experienced, if somebody gives me a photo and I have to paint it, I really have to go back there and experience that moment, because it's very sensory. Like, I need to know what the smells were of that place. I need to feel the light and the warmth or the coldness. And then that influences what colors and what marks I use when I'm making the work. So the next one I was going to show you, which again, I'm going to show you them next to each other because I think it's quite interesting, actually. So one thing that being trained as an architect does is there's a real focus on accuracy. Because as you imagine, when you're building a building, the stakes are quite high. So, no one wants to do the setting out of the brick walls and the foundations incorrectly and then have, a contractor bill for £2 million. So what that does is it forces the profession into a bit of perfectionism. And that's really instilled in you when you're studying. So it's been quite difficult for me to shake that off. And the way that I interpreted how I was taught to paint was that there was actually quite a lot of rules. So, how I understood I should paint, and should is like, this is really important. Yes. Must do it this way.
Expectation,
exactly. And it was like, I wasn't allowed, I only painted from observation, never from photos. I wasn't shouldn't use technology, no tracing, no projection. And also we the way I was taught was not to have a big conceptual narrative, but to focus on the subject and the materials you're using, and also to not really draw from your imagination and just focus on looking at what's in front of you. And that's really influenced how I paint, and I think that's really important. But the other side of it is that now I'm in my 40s, I realize that's not true. It's not true. And actually, what's even more interesting is since I started to confidently call myself an artist, which has been quite an exciting thing for me, is I meet other artists and I find that they've all constructed this framework of unwritten rules of what is right and what is wrong and what is good and what is bad. And it's quite intimidating sometimes if you get into a debate with someone, and they say, you must have it in photography as well.
All the time. I was just thinking.
Yeah. It's like, I would never do digital. I would never do analog. It's just this, and it can be quite a distraction. And actually what I've learned is that it no longer serves me. And in fact, it holds me back. So now I follow what makes me feel good. And I think I wanted to show this piece of work because look at the contrast here. And, you can feel self-conscious showing a sketchbook because it's a bit of a diary, and sometimes you can do things which you might think are a bit cringy or not perfect. But that's why I wanted to show you this, because basically there's an artist that I'm really interested in called Sam Borton, and she specializes in plein air work. So she is passionate about people getting out into the landscape when they're painting. And she encourages using giant brushes, working with your senses, not laboring over details, don't worry too much about perspective. And it's more about being loose and intuitive with your mark making. And that had a profound effect on my work. So this is actually the same place as this. Wow. On a different day. Mm. And basically what I was doing was I was just using two different tones. So black Indian ink, and then a kind of washed out mid-value ink. So it was a kind of grey. And then I basically just made marks, sometimes with my eyes closed, sometimes using my left hand, which is my non-dominant hand. And I loved it. This was so much fun. I think this is one of a series that I did. But I guess what I wanted to highlight was sometimes because I made this and I had a whole series of paintings that I did after this, and I got really good feedback about it, and people felt like they could emotionally connect to it. And so I thought, okay, I need to repeat that repeat, and stay the same, and just make sure that I'm, doing it perfect. But then, my energy was calling me towards doing something more free. So then I'll show you the next one.
Yeah.
Soon after I did that mark making my sketchbook. So I don't know if you can see that, but what I'm doing here is starting to work with water. So obviously my subject matter is the marshes. So there's something about using water to represent water. I've always historically worked with acrylic on paper or wood. And I use wood because I love the super smooth surface. And I've always, probably from being a perfectionist, tried to veer away from, splashes and wonky bits. And with acrylic paint, it dries very quickly. So you can really control the colour. And when you're working on wood, you know exactly how far the paint is going to move when you're moving it. So this was a complete revelation because I started to work on watercolor paper that had a tooth. So that means it's cold pressed and it has a texture to it inbuilt, which was a big deal for me because I have a sensory thing about canvas. I can't use canvas. I can't stand the feeling of even touching it. So I had to kind of push myself and think, okay, I'm going to try, watercolor doesn't working with water doesn't work on paper that's thin. So anyway, I embraced it. And, basically what has been amazing is starting to work with a time element, because with watercolor or with inks, what is such a lovely process is that you add the water and then you watch how the pigments behave. So you're kind of going into a conversation with them. So you're relinquishing control. And that is a really amazing feeling. And at first it was slightly unnerving, but then basically what you find is that you lean into that and you think, okay, so, this dark area here has bled into this area here. And so maybe what if I did some marks that started to look like grasses? And then what if I then dragged this water across? And then you've got here what's called cauliflowering or blooming of the inks. And actually that starts to look like foliage. So suddenly I've gone from, if I show you my previous painting, something very controlled and precise in some ways, and also small. So you imagine the original of this is this big, to something much more free and expressive and much less focused on getting the absolute perfect perspective, which took me a long time here.
Yeah.
And actually just starting to think, how does this place make me feel? And what feeling do I want to convey to anyone who sees this? And what's the energy and what's the weather? And how can I, the feeling of the wind in the sky and the feeling that these grasses are moving. So, what that means is you're starting to play a game, where you have to be patient and you have to wait to see where the ink and the colour is going to, which is a very different discipline to the instant nature of acrylic. So I think it's been quite transformational. The other thing as well is that I've started to spend a lot of time making work with a good friend of mine, Karen Louise George, who's a photographer actually, that she specialises in cyanotype. And so she is very influenced by water and she's very experimental and she likes to play with inks and build up layers. And so that has definitely influenced my work as well. So I think that's also a very nice thing, is that it's not necessarily about just being influenced by artists that you see online or you read about in books or that you go to exhibitions, but actually your contemporaries and your peers, people you're sitting next to, what are they doing and how is that influencing your work and your mark making?
And can I just jump in and ask a quick question?
Course.
I'm looking over here because Erin is only 2 meters away from me, so this is so strange. But that must have been quite tricky, quite difficult to almost just let go and let the art take over a little bit there, because you mentioned earlier about that perfectionist nature of being an architect. So
yes,
that's quite a big breath, isn't it?
Yes, lots of deep breath. Yeah. I think sometimes describe myself as a recovering perfectionist. I think it's a journey, you know. I think it's never going to be completely over. And I think there's a thin line between perfectionism and design, you know, and there's a lot to be said for design, you know, planning your composition, planning your materials, you know, and trying to envision what the final product will look like. But I think the real moment of enlightenment for me has been understanding that there's so much fun to be had in that space in the middle, which is when you're making. And actually, sometimes it doesn't even matter what the final product looks like. And your brain and your body is learning from everything you make. So there's always a benefit. And so, yeah, and also letting yourself make things that are ugly, that's been very difficult. Yeah. Which is why I wanted to show you that page from my sketchbook, because part of my brain is telling me that that's really ugly and I shouldn't show that on camera. But actually, I want to say that, you know, it's really important. You need to have a stack of embarrassing, cringy, terrible, ugly work. Otherwise, you're not doing the work. You know, I think it's, you know, and that's, you know, society, especially with things like Instagram, you know, there's this level of edited perfection that you often see, and you don't see the messy process behind it. Yeah. And so you can get hung up on that. And actually, it's really important to just forget all that and basically try and have fun. That's sort of the name of the game, isn't it?
Really? And that's actually one of the reasons that we came together to put this series together, isn't it? It's
absolutely
to enable people to play, have fun in a safe environment.
Absolutely.
Non-judgmental, that we can come together and do this and share and have fun on the journey.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Thank you. Sorry for interrupting you.
No. I mean, it's a really important thing to also, to acknowledge that I think it's hard for anybody. And I think sometimes the fear of what other people will think of your work can stop you from making work at all. Yeah. And I actually think that that's perhaps what happened to me in those 10 years when I made nothing, because I was working in my job with a lot of artists and designers who were very confident and they were making things, and I didn't have that confidence. And so I thought, if I make anything, it will be too ugly. And what if people see it? So if you can get over that hump of the fear and just start making and listen to your nervous system and how it makes you feel, then you can really, unlock your creativity, which, as we said, will be a really key objective to the course that we're putting on in September.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you.
So we have one more piece to show.
Just one. Oh, my goodness.
Yes.
And nothing switched off.
And it's quite large.
Okay. This is where we may have to cut.
Yes. Okay. So this is a painting I'm actually working on at the moment. And I've returned to acrylic on wood. And it's actually been very interesting because I'm a different person now, having been on my creative journey the last couple of years. And, you know, what I realized is as soon as I went back to working on wood, I had to work out how to create the same energy that I was finding in my sketchbook and with my plein air work that I'd been doing. So what I was starting to do with this one was work with unconventional tools. So my obsession is this blonde grass. Like, I'm completely obsessed with it. And it's a very quintessential Kent scene, really, of this time of year where, you know, the grasses are burnt out and they've got this incredible silvery gold blonde character to them, and this looks super soft. I'm really obsessed with it. My family think I'm crazy. Sometimes I even just walk over to them and start stroking it in when we're out there, because I there's something very sensory for me about grasses blowing in the wind. So this painting, I really wanted to convey that. So what I ended up doing was actually picking grasses and inking them up or covering them in paint and then flicking them onto the wood to create these kind of textures. And then that wasn't fine enough for me. So then I decided to use feathers. So I actually created a lot of these really fine marks with feathers. And I feel like that starts to give this sort of softness. So I think this in the way that I spoke before about using water to convey water, here I started to try and use those natural grasses as brushes and feathers in order to create those textures and actually bring the outside in. So when I'm in my studio, which is actually my garage, how do I create that experience of being out in the marshes when I'm inside? So that's another aspect to it. I think what's also interesting for me is, again, like, look at these colors. Going back to my, my sort of creamy salmon pink and my buttery yellow with my cerulean blue, and that, that feeling of the sun setting and the end of the day and the wind blowing. I really wanted to convey that both through the colors I'm using, but also through the marks I'm using. I also wanted to really, it's really important to me that I wanted to show you this painting whilst it's unfinished, because again, that's me challenging my perfectionism, because, this area here is very crudely drawn. I've just hinted at some of the leaves and things. But I really wanted to have this sort of background, middle ground, foreground. And I think that's something that when I start to finish the painting, I really want to push and probably be more wild, more confident with the contrast in colours in the foreground here. The other thing as well that I think is interesting to anyone who wants to try acrylic painting is I use a coloured ground. So I don't know if you can see poking through, but there's a lot of pink poking through. So before I start work, especially if I'm working on wood, I'll always sand and size, which is a special treatment that you do just to make sure that none of the glues from the plywood come through into your work and, create acid or any kind of effects that might damage it in the future. And then I will put a coloured ground on top. So that's usually, I do all different ones depending on the painting. But because this is a warm, sort of golden hour, sunny evening, I went for a pink, like a warm pink. So I cover the whole canvas in the warm pink. I'm calling it canvas, it's wood. I think you know what I mean. And what that means is that when you're playing with your marks, you can actually leave sections of the pink showing through, and it gives it this sort of depth and warmth and unfinished quality. The truth is, as I move through the painting, those will start to disappear. But what it does is it also makes the colours sing. So, when you put a blue on top of a pink, you end up with a depth to the colour. So what you're working on is what is quite commonly referred to in acrylic painting as glazes, which is where you're layering up the colours. So I think, again, whilst I'm going into detail about painting, in terms of mark making, you can also think about the layering, like, are your marks transparent? Are they opaque? And, for example, here, where I've tried to convey the tree in front of the sky, I've actually then painted the blue on top of the black. So you get this sense that the light is poking through the tree, but I've actually been playing with the layers so that you get this feeling that the leaves are moving. And there's a sense of movement, which is what I wanted to create across the whole piece. So yeah, I think what is quite interesting though, talking about this today, is that what I want to do is to work out how to incorporate water and those effects that I've been doing with the Indian ink and the watercolors into my acrylic painting. So I think the next step for me is to go into more of a mixed media. So perhaps a collage where I'm using paper or absorbent materials overlaid with the acrylic so that I can get that juxtaposition. So I guess what I'm saying is it's just a continual journey, isn't it? It's just like never ending. And I think that's what's so intoxicating about making art, is that you can move with, what seasons are happening, especially as a landscape painter. That's very important to me. And what's going on in your personal life, even the size of space in which you have to work. I've now made a space in my garage so I can work on larger pieces like this. But when I first started, I was painting like that. And that's fine too. You can explore a lot at these different scales. You don't need to have a massive studio in order to get into mark making and painting. So I think in a way, if I reflect back on what I've talked about today and the 5 images I've selected, I think maybe the central message is this idea of releasing myself from perfectionism, and enjoying making things by hand again. And also, working with technology as an aid, but not letting myself go into a rabbit hole with it. I think also what's been really important is this idea of spending time in nature and making art in nature, but also not being afraid to take some grasses home so that when I'm at home, I can recreate that feeling, and use natural tools. And I think just going back to what we talked about earlier, also about your work not necessarily being driven by things being representational or accurate, and more driven by sensation. How did you feel when you were in that place? Or if you're doing a portrait, how do you feel about that person, and trying to convey that, and that being your central focus, so that you don't end up fixating on the details and really creasing your body up and getting really tense. What you want to be feeling is an open chest and an open feeling, and deep breaths. And as soon as you start to feel like you're getting uptight, that's probably a sign that you need to change your approach. Maybe stop what you're doing, or tear it up, or flip it over and scribble all over it. And I think over time, what that means when you let yourself be more playful or instinctive and experimental is a sense of self-trust. And yeah, I guess the other thing I also wanted to convey is, obviously, I really enjoy mark making, and I think it's not just such an amazing thing to do in its own right, but it's also something that can have an impact on your work, and your sense of self, which sounds quite profound, but I genuinely have had that experience myself. So I believe you can have that too. And I think, there might be things that you're already doing in your life, like making bread. I mean, who's making bread? But, you might be making bread. You might be making pizza. You might be sowing seeds in your garden. You might be writing a diary. And those movements and rituals that you're already doing can influence how you make marks. And in turn, that can influence you finding your own voice. And with that idea of having your own practice, which is unique to you and enjoyable and good for you. And as I said, because I've had that experience myself, I'm just so keen that other people can have that too.
Fantastic. And we're so excited to share this. Actually, I'm so excited to share this in September and get people on board and see what people do and see how they explore their own art making as well. I really am. Erin, thanks so much for taking the time to come and visit and play with the equipment in the incredibly hot room today, because it is really, really hot. It's about 30 degrees in Faversham today, so it's very, very hot. So thanks very much for coming to play today. It's been wonderful to see your art and also to hear your passion for trying new things and being on your journey and getting to where you are now and breaking away from those restrictions. And we talk about restrictions in photography an awful lot as well. So it's so refreshing to hear that those restrictions are imposed across a variety of genres. So just before we go, you've written this course, you've produced something that you thought you would really enjoy. And as I always say to people, come and teach something that you really enjoy. So just before we go, who would you feel would be ideal for this course, really? Who do you think would really enjoy coming along to it?
I mean, it's an interesting question, really, because I would say it is open to everyone and would benefit anybody. And that ranges from somebody who perhaps has no art experience at all. Perhaps you don't make any art, you've never made any art, and you just want a way in, to just try some things out and do it in an environment that's inclusive and feels safe, and there's absolutely no judgment. So it could be your way into making art. The other side of it might be you're very experienced in painting or other fine art practice, and you're actually looking for a way to refresh your practice and to, try something new, and perhaps look at getting away from maybe some patterns you found yourself. Maybe you're a bit stuck, and you want to add some new energy and find some new techniques that might really get you excited about your work. And then there's also, I guess, there's other people as well who perhaps has come across this, and you see yourself more as a photographer, and you're intrigued and interested in painting and mark making. And I think, it'd be very interesting for you as well, because there are things that can actually feed into your photography. And having watched the podcast with Jocelyn Horsfall, I was so amazed by her work. And actually, I think there's a lot of mark making in her work. She describes it as painterly. And that was very, very inspiring for me. And I think that connection can be made. And I think that's a real opportunity for anybody who wants to expand their photography practice, by being influenced by these other things as well, like mark making. So I would say it's, if you're intrigued, then go ahead and sign up, basically, because you will be hooked, and it could possibly have a transformational effect on your work, whether it's photography or art. Everybody's welcome.
Thank you. And we're going to do it because we just want to have loads of fun on Saturday morning and have messy play.
Make a mess, basically. Make a mess. That's what we're going to be doing.
Thanks very much, Erin. I will see you in September.
Great. Thanks. See you then.
Thanks so much for taking the time to watch this podcast with the wonderful Erin. If you'd like to hear more about her series, head on over to the Camversation website. The address is on the bottom of this screen. There's loads and loads of interesting things coming up in this series, and it's going to be an incredibly supportive, creative, and most importantly, non-judgmental environment. I hope to see you there.